Hello, and welcome back to the video lecture series for Being Human, its philosophical dimensions. Last time, I left off talking about sexuality expressing something even more primordial. And I would like to suggest that in its most basic form, sexuality is about a union of opposites. It's about two opposing forces coming together and being reconciled. Whether we're talking about male and female, or right and left, or positive, negative, we're talking about the coming together of two fundamentally different things to produce something that is neither one nor the other, but transcends both. Something that is beyond. And this is why sexuality is often incorporated either symbolically or in many cases very practically in religious and magical practice. I always like to talk about the celebration of the Paschal Candle in Western Christianity. Easter time, great big liturgy. One of the celebrations of this liturgy is the anointing of the Paschal Candle. Right? And here's what the ritual contains for the most part. You take this great big candle, and sometimes they're just absolutely massive, and you're going to anoint it with oil, and you're going to mark it off with the sign of a cross and some grains of incense. And then the celebrant is going to take this candle and is going to dip it into the baptismal font, into the waters of baptism. Right? So I want you to think about the symbolism here for a second. Right? We're going to grease up the great big long thing and dip it into the warm wet thing. What could that possibly be about, right? And this ritual is right in the middle of the Mass. And that makes sense, right? It's Easter. And Easter is about birth. It's about rebirth. It's about the return to life. And what symbolizes the return to life and creation of life more than sexuality? That's why we dye eggs. Right? But we can see this in other kinds of practices, and not simply, the sex magic in the Western ceremonial tradition, or the practices of tantric Hinduism or Buddhism, so on and so forth. But there's a sense in which sexuality is always related to the spiritual, to the mystical, to the magical, to our sense of the sacred. And it is in sexuality that something extraordinary happens. The fascist author Julius Evola writes in a book he calls Metafisico del Sesso, right, the metaphysics of sex. He writes extensively about the use of sexuality to summon magical power. And this power comes from reaching towards something that is not subject to the kinds of dichotomies and bifurcations that exist in this world. The material world is a world of oppositions. You've got protons and electrons, you've got male and female, you've got all these dichotomies, right? And you've got all these binary oppositions, but the spiritual world transcends this. And when we talk about God, sure, in the Christian tradition, we talk about God as Father. In many traditions, the gods are anthropomorphized, they're male, they're female. But I think all of us get the sense that there's something not exactly right about that. I mean, if we're talking about gods, or, well, even if we're talking about God singular, right? How could you limit that divine being to a single biological sex? How could you limit it by saying that it's so bodily? Right? It doesn't have a body. There seems to be something fundamentally wrong about saying, well, God is male. But it's equally wrong to say that God is female. It's even wrong to say that God is both, or God is neither. It's just that God doesn't participate in this dichotomy. As a spiritual being, it transcends these oppositions. So, practice for certain magicians and ceremonialists, tantrists, is a way to approximate the divine through sexuality, to approximate God's being whilst still residing in a physical body. Because Eros is ultimately about bodies. It's about something material. It's about our embodiment, our physicality. the facticity of our experience of the world in and through this localized meat suit that we've got. That to be human is not just to be a spirit, a soul, or reason. Because these things, important as they are, only express part of what it means to be a human being. Because human beings are also bodies. Descartes recognizes this very clearly. I've referenced this before. At the end of Book 5 of the Discourse on Method, he's talking about the soul. And he says that it must be expressly created. Right? But he also says that it's not enough for the soul to be housed in the body like a pilot in a ship. That it has to be fused, that it has to be connected, it has to be intertwined with the body. But the soul and the body, they have to function together. Aristotle had this sense that the soul was the animating principle of the body. It didn't really have an existence separate from the body, which is very different from Plato, who insists that the soul, unlike the body, is immortal. But I think that focusing or looking at humanity through the lens of Eros gives us an opportunity to recognize that our embodiment is an important aspect of what it means to be human. And if we think of being human entirely through the lens of the soul, or rationality, or something like that, then we miss this really important aspect of what it means to be human. To be human is not just to be the ghost in the machine, because if it were, the machine would never do so many of the wonderful things that human beings do. The machine would never dance, it would never embrace, and it would never have sex. These things come not just from the body or from the soul, but from the union of the two. Again, Descartes specifically mentions this because he says that the soul and the body have to be fused in order to exhibit the passions, the sentiments, the appetites, these desires that are specifically like ours, and thus, he says, to make up a true human being. So he says that the real illustration of the real symptom of being a human being is not just having a body, right? Because, well, animals have bodies too. And it's not just having a soul, because God has a soul. And so to be human is to have both together. And that's what generates these emotions and appetites. Appetite is, in Descartes' words, something that makes us uniquely human. Now, I don't necessarily think that Descartes is thinking of this in erotic terms, but I think it has a lot to do with Eros. For the Greeks, Eros was conceived as a power that draws things together, and it was related to himeros. Himeros is desire, and this gets translated in Latin as libido. You know that word if you've studied psychology. So himeros, or desire, draws things together. It's a sort of gravitational force. And a lot of the pre-Socratic philosophers talk about Eros and himeros as something much more primordial than simply sexuality. Human sexuality is a manifestation of this cosmic principle, this thing that draws together the universe. St. Thomas Aquinas suggests that what imparts motion to the world has to be something that itself does not move. Right? The prime mover, the unmoved mover, the first cause. He's getting this from Aristotle. And that first cause, that is to say, for Aquinas, God, moves other things through desire, because they are drawn to it as it were by gravitation. So there's something really cosmic about Eros when the Greeks talk about it. But I think it's also important to recognize some of the very specific structures that are peculiar to the Greek experience of sexuality, particularly that of the relationship of the lover and beloved. When the Greeks use this terminology, lover and beloved, 99 times out of 100, they're referring specifically to the relationship between an older man and a younger man. They'll say a boy, right? But we're not talking about pedophilia, right? We're not even talking about hebephilia. We're talking about the relationship between an older man and a younger man, I don't know, 17, 18, 19 at least, maybe even older than that. When we talk about Greek homosexuality, which is itself an extraordinary misnomer, right? Because as we've noted before, the term homosexuality doesn't even occur until the 19th century. When we're talking about that, we're talking about this very complex structure of relationships that aren't simply a matter of sex in a simpler, straightforward way. Because the relationship between the lover and beloved, it is sexual, right? Make no mistake about that. I'm not trying to whitewash anything here. But even in Plato's time, there's beginning to be a sense that if it's only sexual, if it's primarily sexual, then that relationship is debased, it's perverse, you're misusing it. This relationship ought to be something much more than that. And there are a couple of elements to it. On the one hand, it was the expression of a love of beauty. Right, of beauty generally. The older man would recognize in the boy something of the manifestation of beauty in the world. But the lover also served as a kind of mentor, as a kind of gateway to political life. And there was a profound political and educational content to the lover-beloved relationships. That's why when we're looking at this, we're looking at a relationship that is largely, almost exclusively reserved for the citizen class. Right? And when we're talking about the citizen class in Athens, we're talking about 10 to 15% of the population. So we're talking about an aristocratic class. We're talking about an elite. And this was something that was part of the citizen class. It was part of this privileged elite. And to a certain extent, it was the purview of citizens who were first and foremost warriors. Athens is still very much a warrior community, and sort of through the 5th through the 3rd centuries when we're talking about classical Athens. So when we talk about the lover-beloved relationship, which is going to be a big focus in Symposium, we're talking about something that combines early democratic politics, militarism, and sexuality in a really complicated kind of witch's brew. And I think that if we simply refer to these relationships as homosexual, we do a disservice. Because first of all, nobody would identify in the same way that we use these designations of orientation today as gay or straight or bi or ace or pan or whatever, right? Those kinds of designations don't really make sense for the Greeks at this time because, well, take Socrates as an example. Right? He has male beloveds. Right? He's also got a wife. He's also got kids. And these are just two very, very different kinds of structures. So do we say, oh, well, Socrates is gay? No, not really. Well, Socrates is straight? No, not really. Socrates is bi? Well, not in any meaningful sense of the word. These categories simply don't apply in the way that we use them today. When we get into Symposium, and particularly Pausanias' speech, I want to say more about this because I think that it's important in understanding the way that this plays out, the way that this unfolds in Symposium. So over the next couple of weeks, what we're going to be doing is looking at this wonderful, weird text called Symposium. And Symposium is structured as a series of speeches about Eros, in praise of Eros. And each one is going to build on the previous one in a unique way. So there's a kind of trajectory, a kind of ascent. And this will ultimately culminate in the speech of Diotima, even though she herself is not present at this symposium. Only men are allowed. So her speech is given through the mouth of Socrates. Socrates is going to, he says, repeat the speech of Diotima. And that speech of Diotima raises some really important questions about the relationship between Eros, love, and human nature. And it is in turn taken up over and over again by philosophers like the German Romantics, people like Schlegel, Hölderlin, Hölderlin in particular, very interested in this figure of Diotima, but also the 20th and 21st century among French and German continentalist philosophers. And I'm including in that category Luca Irigaray, whom we're going to be reading later on, who is neither French nor German, who writes this wonderful essay called L'amour sorcier, Sorcerer Love, which is a reading of Diotima's speech in Symposium. So we're going to use that as our sort of jumping off point to talk about the relationship between Eros and human nature